The ceasefire in the Gaza Strip has now broken down. The Israelis never wanted it to proceed to the second stage. Israeli foreign policy, in large measure, consists of one thing. What can we get away with? It's rather comparable to, we all live in a street, and in one house in the street there is this completely psychopathic family who are always smashing your windows, beating your children up, stealing your goods and so on. And if you call the police, they beat you up. Now we have this, it's complicated narrative in the West. If you listen to Israelis themselves, that's Israeli journalists, pundits, politicians, members of the public, and above all, soldiers, they don't think it's complicated. It's very clearly about ethnic cleansing. And the rhetoric of those who hold power in Israel has been absolutely clear about this right from the beginning. When people show you who they are, believe them. What's happened in Gaza isn't complicated. It's genocide. It is the greatest crime of the 21st century, and it would not have been possible without the complicity and indeed active assistance of Western politicians and of the Western media. Apartheid is not an issue. It's not on the one hand this, on the other hand that. It's a crime. Ethnic cleansing is not an issue. It's a crime. And above all, genocide is not an issue. It's a crime. But as long as the bulk of Western media is reporting the whole thing as it's complicated, on the one hand this, on the other hand that, then the Israelis are getting away with it. The most extreme right-wing, Greater Israel expansionist elements in Israel are now clearly emboldened. You have this profoundly unstable apartheid state, and it would appear now expansionist country which has nuclear weapons. I mean, it's hard to overstate how dangerous this is, and yet we just apparently prepared to carry on taking it as given that it is Israel that is our ally. In the West, politicians simply don't understand that we have moved into another era now where Western claims of moral legitimacy, in as much as they were ever worth much and ever taken seriously, have now gone forever. The West has no moral legitimacy at all, because although for some reason Western politicians and journalists are able to watch 20,000 children being slaughtered in the Gaza Strip, in the global South, people seem to have a much stronger sense that these were human beings that have been killed. And the West's moral legitimacy, its ability to invoke the rule of law, to invoke human rights, has been destroyed for decades. Most people in Britain have watched images of small children being murdered for 15 months and just thought this is wrong and ought to stop, which is a realization that doesn't seem to have got through to the political class. Within America, there is now a colossal assault on the most basic democratic institutions. Going hand in hand with that is a huge assault on the institutions of international law. October the 7th is used to justify everything, but apparently nothing justifies October the 7th. Now, very, very real human rights abuses were committed on October the 7th. But if you are horrified by the murder of 700, 800 civilians on October the 7th, then logically you ought to be equally horrified by the murder of, what's quite probably more than 70,000 Palestinians since, and there's just no comparison in the way the two are covered in Western media. Quite often it's clear that the civilian population is not collateral damage, it is the target in itself. I think there were a few weeks, certainly after October the 7th, where the Israeli targeting processes provided the thinnest veneer for what was essentially a punitive slaughter. And then thereafter, the widespread destruction of property, as is now becoming clear, the intention was to render the Gaza Strip unlivable. That ethnic cleansing of 2 million people from their homes is being presented as a real estate plan, sort of blue skies thinking, is quite grotesque. We're talking here about probably the greatest crime of the 21st century so far. Just imagine how this would be being reported if it was 2 million Israelis who were being driven from their homes. If they really do want to drive 2, 3, 4, 5 million Palestinians out of Gaza and the West Bank, the consequences will be devastating. It would quite probably lead to the fall of the regimes in Jordan and Egypt, and could even lead to protracted wars between Israel and those countries. And it's surprising that sort of cooler heads don't kick in at the CIA and in the Pentagon and so on. How is this in America's interest? You have this brutal apartheid state controlling the Al-Aqsa Mosque, inevitably alienating the Arab countries, the Muslim countries around it. It buggers up America and the West's relationship with a third of the world For what? A bit of security cooperation, a bit of military cooperation, which they need against those countries precisely because they have alienated them so much. It is quite extraordinary. You would never guess who was the superpower and who was the client state. The Israelis treat the Americans with absolute contempt. And it is quite bizarre the degree to which the American political establishment is prepared to make itself subordinate to what the Israelis perceive to be their own national interests. For decades now, life has been made a lot easier for the Israelis because their borders with Egypt and Jordan are shored up. They have sort of understandings with the monarchy in Jordan and the dictatorship in Egypt. It really looks as if the Americans and Israelis are in danger of blowing up those relationships. Peter Oborne and myself were in Jordan, and we had a number of meetings with very well-placed senior sources who wanted clearly to get a message across that was coming from the government. And their message was very clear. They will go to war before they accept large flows of refugees across the Jordan from the West Bank or from Gaza. They acknowledged Jordan will inevitably lose a war with Israel and lose a war very easily. The point they were making is that they have no choice for two reasons. Firstly, Jordan is a country of 12 million people, almost all of whom live in a thin strip of land along the Jordan River. They're the third poorest water country in the world. They simply can't accommodate a flow of 2 million refugees. The economy, the country, the ecosystem simply can't absorb it. Secondly, their own dynastic self-interest. You already have a situation where the majority of the population in Jordan is Palestinian. This led to civil strife in 1970, Black September, when there was civil war. You get 2 million embittered, angry, probably Hamas-oriented Palestinians crossing the Jordan. It completely disrupts the internal balance of Jordan and probably leads to the fall of the dynasty. So what they were saying is they would simply have no choice. Of course, they lose. But then Israel has done an extraordinary thing. It has blown up the security that it has had along its eastern frontier for well over half a century, a security guaranteed by the Kingdom of Jordan. And I'm sure the sort of cooler heads within Shin Bet and Mossad must be absolutely horrified at this prospect. Now, let's pick apart what the Israelis are trying to do. Look at the words of Bezalel Smotrich, who is the man in control of the West Bank at the moment and the man who is effectively driving things. He recently made a statement which fascinatingly echoes almost exactly a statement made by a very, very right-wing Tsarist minister in Russia in the 1880s about the Jews, where he said, "A third must die, a third must emigrate, a third must assimilate." Smotrich effectively said the same thing just recently about the Palestinians, and that is the plan. They essentially want a country without significant numbers of Palestinians. Now, that seems so horrific and absurd that we assume it can't happen, but it has happened in other countries around the world. The indigenous population has effectively been wiped out. The other course of action is what people from Hamas and close to Hamas will say to you. They will always cite the examples of Vietnam, of Algeria, of South Africa. Sacrifice is the price of freedom, and it costs hundreds of thousands of lives, but you always get there in the end. If you actually look at settler colonial countries, you just have to spend time on the West Bank, just spend time at a roadblock on the West Bank, and you get it. It is so humiliating to yourself personally, to yourselves as a people, to yourselves as a nation. Every waking day of a Palestinian's life is humiliation. No people in history have ever resigned themselves to being second-class citizens in their own countries. The only places where that's happened is where they have effectively been, in large measure, wiped out. I mean, just imagine a fantasy world where you have the same sort of process that happened in South Africa and you have it in Israel, where Israel becomes a non-ethnic democracy, a country where people of all faiths and nationalities and ethnicities have full political, civil and human rights. Now, at that point, two-state, one-state, whatever, it all becomes quite easy. Once the requirement of ethnic hegemony has gone, it all becomes a lot easier. And just imagine how many problems around the world, how many problems that flow outwards from Israel are suddenly resolved if that's the case. As ever, the Israel-Palestine story is a perfect example of the inadequacy of mainstream media, which really doesn't seem able to cover this story properly. And it's an illustration of why we desperately need outlets like Double Down News. And I would urge you to support Double Down News in any way you can through Patreon.